All righty, welcome. I am Heather Pierce Campbell, the legal website warrior. I'm an attorney and legal coach based here in Seattle, Washington, serving information entrepreneurs throughout the US and the world. Welcome to another episode of Guts, Grit, and Great Business. I am super excited to bring you my friend and a brilliant human being to you today, Karen Rowe. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk to you today.
Oh, I'm so excited. I feel like this is like years in the making. I mean, I've known Karen a handful of years now, and we are on opposite corners of the United States, right? So Karen's down in Florida. We were just talking about that big, horrible storm that hit. But Karen is an amazing writer and she helps other people write books. And this is such an important topic, I think, for so many of the expert-based businesses that I serve. And I love writers. I've always been enamored by people that write books and somehow, especially if they're doing other things, like make time and figure out how to incorporate that into their business and their life as well. So Karen, I'm really looking forward to this. For those of you that don't know Karen Rowe, Karen is an international best-selling author. She has worked on 145 books and counting in her nearly 14-year career as a professional writer. She is an expert in nonfiction and can help you position yourself as a leading authority in your niche. Karen develops professionally written and designed books done for you. Her clients include an actor, a retired FBI agent, a reality TV star, entrepreneurs with online empires, and some of the top self-help leaders in the industry. Her mission is to help you find your voice and uncover your own unique and powerful story to create an instant connection with your marketplace. Karen, I love that.
Thanks for
Uh,
having me.
Oh, yes, this will be so much fun. I would love to know, talk to us where your love of writing began.
Well, I used to be a teacher, so in my past life, I call it, I was teaching.
Mhm.
And as I moved, so I've always loved languages, I've always loved humanities in general. But in my teaching career, I realized pretty early on, about 3 or 4 years into my teaching, that I wasn't going to be a lifer. And in those days, this was in, like, say, around 2007, blogging was quite big. And so I'd started my own blog and very naturally started writing more and more, and that started taking up more and more of my time. And there was absolutely nothing interesting on this blog, right? Like, it was so innocuous. It was about here's my Oscar predictions, here's my opinion about Rosie O'Donnell on The View, you know. And even before blogging, I was always going on vacation and sending emails to my friends and families about my adventures. And then that translated into this travel blog. And when I looked at what not wanting to be teaching anymore, I couldn't think of what else to do, and ended up just deciding I was going to be a writer. There's a bit of a big story that I don't necessarily want to go into the weeds around, but what happened was I was suspended from my teaching career for blogging from a school computer. I was very naive in those days. I didn't understand what it meant to schedule a post. So I was writing them at night, but I didn't want to have more than one post a day. So I wait till I got to school and then post it. And it's ironically, now blogging is a tool used in schools to help engage students. But at that time, it constituted misuse of time and theft of equipment. And so it ended up being a professional scandal. I was transferred to a different school, and I never got a chance to address my students about what had
Oh,
happened. It was veiled in secrecy. There was a gag order. They told my colleagues that I had been suspended for inappropriate internet use, which of course made it sound like I was running a
oh,
kiddie porn ring or something instead of
oh my
just writing
gosh.
a blog.
Oh my gosh,
Um,
Karen, there's so many parts about this story that I'm like, what? What? Oh.
yeah. And, people were making decisions about me that had never set foot in my classroom or never assessed me as a
Mm.
teacher. There was a student involved and some parents involved that were both attorneys. And then on top of that, we had a brand new principal. So it was a bit of a perfect storm. I personally felt that the consequence didn't match the crime.
Right.
But they essentially determined that it was in breach of like the code of conduct of professional ethics. So they transferred me to a different school, and that was really the beginning of the end for me. And then what I realized out of that whole process is that the thing I was most upset about was that they had asked me to delete my blog. So I was like, oh, that's a breadcrumb, right? Like that's a clue about what is interesting and important to you. So I basically left teaching and started writing, or started blogging. And
Mm.
6 months later, I had a publishing contract to write my first book. So, I mean, we could definitely talk about that, where it's like, if you want to do something, just start doing it. And I would
Wow.
say everything really fell into place. I started blogging for free for our local newspaper. From there, I got I got reached out to start doing articles, and then I got on retainer, and I did very well as a freelance writer, but there's a lot of hustle, right? So even though I might
Yes.
get paid, let's say $300 for 2 hours of work, trying to find those
The next, the
those
next, the
the
next
next
gig, the
thing,
next. Yeah,
there's just a lot of hustle. So
totally.
what my first book contract, they wanted it out for a specific deadline. So I only had 6 weeks to write the book. And I did that. And then I met a business coach who you and I both know, Jay Facette, who
Mm.
said, hang on, you wrote a book in 6 weeks. That's your business. Like that is what people will pay you for. So, I basically started my business in about 2009, and
Mm.
the rest is history, I guess. I mean, I wasn't initially writing books all the time. I was doing all kinds of writing, including freelance and blog writing and copywriting. And what I realized is my love is really in nonfiction book writing and memoirs. And then in 2015, I came up with what's now my signature offering, which is known as Book at the Beach. And that was basically to solve a time problem versus an ideas and creativity problem, right? So I'm working with
Yeah.
a lot of entrepreneurs and business owners. And, if you've written a book, you know that writing a book, um, you don't get billable hours for writing a book, right? So you either have to take time out of your billable hours and your week and running your business, or you have to take it out of evenings and weekends. And a lot of the
Mm.
authors that I work with are committed to families and kids, right? So they don't want to do that either. But most of them can find 3 days to basically, show up. We're in a hotel room, and I'm essentially interviewing them and getting everything that I need from them over those 3 days to basically just get the down draft, right? That initial
Mhm.
draft. So
Oh my heavens, there's so many parts of your story that so first of all, I know that we've known each other for a little bit, and I didn't know some of the,
yeah.
the pieces of your trail that led you here. The first thing I want to say is I'm so sorry about the painful experience,
Yeah.
and at the same time it led you to right what you're doing now. And so, anyways, there's just always an irony of like going through really hard stuff like that, but when it leads you to what's supposed to come next, right? It's sometimes, and I don't know how you feel about that, like you wouldn't go back and necessarily change the path. It launched you in a whole new direction. And I love the aha moment of like, what? Delete the blog. So I have to ask you, did you actually delete the blog?
Well, I did. I had to.
Had to.
However, I was able 9 months later, when I realized that that's what was upsetting me most about the entire situation, I was able to contact Blogspot, is who it was, and they restored it within 24 hours. So I was able to get it. And you're right. I will say a lot of personal development, 10 years of it. I was eventually able to see that this was actually the best thing that's ever happened to me. It really forced an outcome that I may never have made on my own. I mean, teaching in Canada is a sweet gig. I was well paid. I was teaching in a wonderful school. I had great students. in subject matter that was, I was trained to teach. And, I had summers off. I traveled every summer. We get paid, over the summer. There was a lot about it that worked. I liked that we got a fresh start at the start of every school year. We had autonomy within our own classrooms. And then in the summer, you're on a real break. You don't have work piling up, right, while you're away. So there's a lot about it that worked. And I think it would have been easy just to put up with that and settle with that. And so this situation forced, and if I had really been listening and attentive, I would have left on my own before creating this crisis, basically.
Right.
That took the decision out of my hands.
Yeah. Well, and the what does Oprah call it? The brick in the face, right? The 2x4 in the face, right? So when we're not doing the thing that we should be doing, we're not following that little internal voice, life can just give us the brick in the face instead. And
I was also very young. Like, I think now if that situation were to happen again, I would have stood up for myself. I would have been a lot more vocal. But I was actually was someone who had always followed the rules. I was a real good girl. So like for me to be in trouble and get called to the principal's office literally, and then have to go and, defend my actions and everything, like I just was not used to that. So I just thought if I do everything that they say, it will be fine. And I truly believe that they were just, they might put a note in my file, or, a disciplinary action in my file, but I never thought that I would get transferred. And I think for them, it felt like a good compromise. I kept my job, and
it's still so weird. All the secrecy around it and being like inappropriate online action, like that bugs me so bad. I just think like sometimes human nature is just so weird, right? Humans are weird.
Yeah. So, I mean, if it were to happen now, I'm a little bit older and I know how to stand up for myself in a different way. But ultimately, I'm much more happy and much more fulfilled doing what I do now. I do feel like I was put on this earth to help people write books, and I really get fulfillment in helping other people achieve a result that they couldn't achieve without me, right? Like there's legitimately people that I've worked with that have been trying to write a book for 20 years, and then they get it published, and I'm like, yes, like
I'm sure
I made a difference.
Totally. I'm sure we've got some people listening who have a book in them that are like, oh my gosh, I'm in that category of knowing for years that I want to write something, but the whole process, right? It's like, and even for some people, I think like, launching any new thing in the world, starting a podcast, I remember before I even knew really what it took at all to do a podcast, it felt like this outrageously big mountain to climb, right? And so, without somebody's help, I think that a lot of times we just don't even get started. I love Mr. J Facette, of course, and his ability to just be like, there's your business, like solve the time problem for people that this presents, right? And it is a major time problem. I suspect, and I don't know the answer to this question, but why do people sit on it for so long? Is it about like they just think it's going to be a monumental amount of time and they just don't see where they have that, or is it something else?
I think there's kind of three main problems that get in people's way. One, sometimes they're not sure the content that they have is any good. Most of the time, what I would say is that, especially the people I work with, they're very passionate about their subject matter, but for whatever reason, it just doesn't translate onto the page. So they might sit down and they don't know where to start. They don't know which stories to include, which ones to leave out. So they just feel overwhelmed. So while they can speak easily to people about their subject matter or their idea, they can't get it written in a way that makes sense to another person. But like I said earlier, the biggest problem I solve is this time problem. Most of them are just too busy or successful to sit down and write on a regular basis. And I mean, there's a whole slew of problems. Fear is one, right?
I was going to say actually putting your voice out there into the world, right? And I think writing feels so close. Like at least, I know that I've gone through periods of my life where I've been able to write and then others where I haven't been able to write. And I think as I reflect on it, like the fear of Like this is my like this is the essence of who I am. Putting that out into the world feels really scary.
Well, it's very vulnerable, right? A lot of
Yeah.
times you're sharing information about yourself or your business that you've never shared publicly before.
Mm-mm.
So that can feel really scary. And just, what if no one reads it? What if it doesn't make a difference? And then there's a resource issue as well, not just money, but time, right? Like,
Yeah.
is this the highest and best use of my time?
Yeah, right. The
Yeah.
trade-offs of should I be doing this versus something else. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I going back to the piece of your story about like you could have stayed doing the other thing.
hmm
It's so interesting because I think about so many things in life. And it's actually, do you remember Jay's presentation that he does about building a business that's doing just well enough? You hang on, but never.
hmm
And I can't remember, he has a whole name for like that model or that little exercise. But it's never like the thing that you really thought it was going to be, right? It's not
hmm
really producing the kind of income or whatever. I feel like it's such a great analogy to other things in life. It's like, what came to mind is when you were talking about, summers off and all these
Yeah.
benefits, and it was just good
Yeah.
enough that I probably would have talked myself into staying. It's like my first marriage, total like,
Yeah.
right?
Well, I
Like,
actually say I say I loved everything about teaching except the teaching, right? Like I
mm,
actually loved the org days and the learning and the planning. And I actually did love the students as well, but the
mhm,
students weren't actually my clients, right? Like
yeah.
more and more the administration pandered to the needs of the parents. And so I was hard headed enough that I'm like, no, I mean, the students are my clients, not you. So, but it's more than that. Like I have friends to this day that are still teaching and teaching at the same school that I taught at, and on our spare time, at dinners and evenings and weekends and stuff, they would be talking about pedagogy and
Yeah. Right.
and I was like, oh yeah, this is not what I'm interested in talking about. Or how can they rejig assessment so that it's more student focused and things like that. And I'm like, oh, okay, I am not, this is not where my thoughts are when I'm not in the school. So
Yeah,
that's
that's
another good
right.
indicator of where my passion and interest was that I didn't necessarily see until much later.
Yeah, yeah, it's so interesting to reflect on those, different times where we could have stayed on this path or taken this turn and instead we took this one, right?
Mhm,
Um, when you were in the days of freelancing, I'd love to know like
mhm,
when did it shift for you from freelancing to, creating your own business around it, right? You mentioned Jay Facette making a comment.
mhm,
I'd love to
mhm.
know those early days of how you began to actually set yourself up as an entrepreneur doing
Sure.
this in your own business.
Well, I mean, first of all, I couldn't believe that I was getting paid to write. So that's where what I say to people is like, what would you do for free, or what are you already doing for free? And
Mhm.
as I mentioned, I had been sending emails to my friends and family on vacation, and then that turned evolved into a travel blog, and then, you know, so like when someone was paying me $300 to first like go to a movie, a concert, a festival, a
You're
show,
like,
and then I
dang
get free
it.
tickets for the show, and then I get to write about it and get paid for it, and then they publish it, and then people like, I was like, this is great. So that part was fun, but the
Mm,
thing is, like, in the reality of like, okay, that $300 for 2 hours of work was great, but I have a rent to pay and bills to
yes.
pay, things like that, right? So what I actually say to people is don't do it the way I did it, because I left teaching, so I had no income. So I worked at a temp agency for a while, and that was actually great because I didn't have to bring work home with me. So I was going in, working a 9 to 5. I was doing some basic admin work, and I was
Mm,
working in the mail room at an oil and gas
right. You were
company.
scrapping it
So
all together.
yeah. So, I mean, the great thing about that is that met my financial needs.
Mm,
And then I had bandwidth and energy to come home and write articles and go to these events and things like that on the weekends that were paying. And then when I got that book contract, I told you that I only had 6 weeks to write it. And that was a
mhm.
flat fee for service.
Oh,
So,
wow.
it was not commission or royalty based or anything. And I'll just tell you that how much I got paid for that book was $4,000, which, let me tell you, I was like, I have arrived. I quit my temp job. I got paid $4,000 in 6 weeks. And I'm like, I'm here. Like, I was Rocky Balboa on the top of the steps, right?
Bring
Then
it,
they
bring it.
Yeah, I'm quitting my job. And then I got a second book deal from that same publisher, and it was the same $4,000, but they're like, don't worry, we're going to give you 3 months to write it. So at first I was relieved, but then I was like, oh crap, like I'm spending all of my time doing this research and writing for this book. And so then I had to, of course, get another temp job. And so then at one point I was working 2 or 3 different jobs, plus trying to write a book.
Oh,
Plus, I was faced with all kinds of, like, I think the first book I had a fear of failure, but I didn't have enough time to overthink it because I had a deadline. The second book, then I was comparing myself to the first book, and I had like a fear of success. And so there was just a bunch of things that I had to confront in who I was, and am I really going to make a goal of this, and all that sort of stuff. So out of that, in desperation, I reached out to Jay, who was doing business coaching at the time, and ended up joining one of his mastermind groups. And so I was spending every weekend for a while there, just learning how to build a business and things like that, right?
yeah.
So, and then just applying. I mean, the good thing about publishing those first 2 books with a publisher was that I really got to cut my teeth in the process and learn how it worked and things like that. And then I was starting to apply that with clients, and at first I kind of took any, you want me to write something? I'll take it. I'll do blogs, I'll do, whatever. And that's really how I got my start, is that I was taking temp work and contract work and part-time stuff to cover the rent, until I could make a full go of my business, which wasn't really until I moved to the United States in 2013. And again, interestingly, I created a situation where I wasn't legally entitled to do any other work except for write. So, like, I couldn't then go get a job as a barista at the Starbucks or anything like that. So it really forced me to be all in. And I would have told you before that I was all in, but kind of creating that situation where I had no escape hatch, where it's like, listen, if this business can't sustain me, and it's not viable, and the consequences were so big that it forced me to confront some of the things that I hated doing, like making sales calls and asking for, and closing the deal, like, and then I had to confront, like, the value that I bring to someone. And there was a lot of development work done around, again, I told you I would work for free, and I practically was for a lot of years, versus understanding what I do is worth to somebody else, not what it's worth to me, what it's worth to somebody else. So that was the gift in moving to the United States, is that, if I didn't make it, I would have to get on a plane and move back to Canada, which I just didn't want to do at that time. So,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, yeah, it is so interesting that, I love the language, like, here you set yourself up for a circumstance that, like, literally forced your growth to the next level, right, in your
Yeah.
business, and
Yeah.
having to make a go of it. What, like, as you look back, do you have a favorite part of your journey? Do you have a part of your journey that just is like one of and it could be a turning point or something that just really stands out to you?
Well, I mean, for me, it was, I had multiple goals in the business. And around 2016, my goal was to be debt free. No, 2015, my goal was to be debt free. And 2016 was my goal to hit 6 figures in the business. And I did both of those. And then just, after that, it was like, I want to buy a house. And let me tell you, buying a house in the United States when you're not a citizen or a permanent resident and you're self-employed took something, right?
Yes.
So,
Yes.
yeah. So for me, really, when, now I basically work part-time hours and have a full-time income. So for me, that, and I know that people like Jay, or like, you want to set up your business so that you can, it runs
Step away.
without you and all that
Right.
sort of stuff.
Right.
But like, I'm really happy doing what I do, and I don't want to 10x my business, and I don't
Yes.
want to,
Well,
you know,
that's right. There are certain people who just really are service providers, right? They
yeah,
love doing the service. And I support a lot of those folks who come from like the professional spaces, and I'm one of those people too, right? That
yeah,
provides a service that requires my time. So I totally understand. And I love, yeah, I love, hearing the parts of where like the big step forwards and reaching certain milestones and like the meaning for
yeah.
that for you, because um, now hearing about like your book at the beach, which you do on a weekend, right? And you sit down with somebody for what is it, 3 days?
3 days, yeah.
3 days. Yeah. So talk to us about even how your services evolved to what you're doing now, right? Tell us about
Mm-hmm.
this part-time schedule and what it is that you help folks with.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I do still really like the client facing work, and I still
Mhm.
really like developing that first draft, right? Because I think the most challenging thing for people with writing a book is going from nothing to something. Like
Yeah.
now you have on paper what was in your head. So that for
Yeah.
me is still deeply satisfying. So I still do that.
Mm,
I do less of it, right? So like the most books I've ever done at one time was 12,
mm.
and it was too much.
That sounds like a lot.
It was a lot. And I wasn't, I'm not on my own. I do have a stable of editors. I have graphic designers that do the cover and the layout and things like that. I've had a variety of different assistants that help me with transcripts, or I've had like a director of operations. So, just feeling out what works.
Mm,
And really, when the pandemic hit, my business was impacted quite a bit by people obviously reassessing their own businesses and whether or not it worked for them to have a book
yeah.
that time.
Yeah.
So I really scaled back quite a bit and started doing the work more myself. I just do fewer books now. So like right now, I think I
Hmm.
have 5. I was doing 8 at the start of the year, and I was working weekends more often than I wanted to. So now I've just really learned to say no or refer them to colleagues if I'm not an absolute hell yes. And we were talking about that before the podcast. Like, I feel like everyone says, like, oh, if it's not a hell yes, it's a no, which seems really practical and straightforward, except often choosing to write a book or even running a business can be quite emotional, right? Especially when
Yeah.
there's income wrapped up into it. And so it's hard when I have a really viable author who has the money to hire us,
It's hard to
for
say
me to say
no.
no because I'm already at capacity, and the
Yeah.
stress of it is not worth it to me. And I also know myself. I don't take any project lightly. Like
Yes.
I jump in with both feet. I'm in there with you till the end. And it's also not a short-term engagement. Like I'm working with my authors a minimum of 9 months, but it's often closer to a year or a year and a half. So like I really
Wow.
do need to love them, love
Yes.
their idea, be invested in them to get them over the finish line, right? And there's so many X factors. There's so many
Yeah.
things that can happen in my life, in my authors' lives. Include pandemic is a good example, but there's all kind, people are getting COVID, they're,
Oh, yeah.
whatever, there's a hurricane, right? Like there's just so many things that can impact timelines and deadlines that I've just had to be more intentional and more mindful about how many projects I'm taking on.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Oh,
yeah.
it's such an important lesson. I feel like for so many people in their businesses, right? I'd love to like shift a little bit to the author side and ask you a few
Yeah,
questions for like business
sure.
owners that are experts that are thinking
Mm-hmm.
about writing a book. What do you see? What are some of the top mistakes that people make when they are trying to write a book?
I mean, I think the first mistake that they make obviously is trying to do it by themselves, especially to save
Mm,
money. Um, the other thing is, I don't think a lot of people, unless you've written a book, have any idea how long it takes, how
yeah.
complex it is, how much editing is required, and just the different levels of it, especially now since we're self-publishing, right?
Yeah.
So in the old days of when you had a publisher, you would focus on the writing, but you had an editor, and it was a fairly straightforward back and forth. And then they would take on all the pre-publication, meaning they would take on the cover design and the layout. They would often have final say for picking the title and the cover. But now that we're in the days of self-publishing, not only are you focused on writing it, but you're also focused on making the decisions for all of those things like title and cover, and you don't know what you're doing. So it can be very overwhelming. There's a lot of decision fatigue. Authors also don't set aside enough time for it. And what I always say is, writing the book is actually only 50% of the determining the success of a book. The other 50% is in the marketing. So
strategy,
people focus,
marketing.
People focus on the writing, and they get to the end and they're like, oh, thank goodness I'm done. Now what? And it's like, well, actually, you need another, 6 to 9 months to start to market this book and set it up. So it's kind of like you're having a housewarming and you invite a bunch of people over, but you haven't moved into the house yet, right? Like you have the house, but there's a bunch of people at your door and you're like, oh, okay, I wasn't ready. So that's a mistake. And then just in terms of the writing, what I would say is one of the biggest mistakes is they don't know who they're writing to. Like I've heard people say like, oh, my book is for everyone, which is kiss of death, right? Because the more I'm really a fan of micro niching. So the more clear and specific you can be, the more likely you are to attract that person. And are you going to get people that fall on either side of that target? Absolutely. But a book, especially a title, the joke is, the title of a book says, hey, you, and the subtitle says, yes, you, so that the people know like, oh, this is the book for me.
Oh, I love it. Hey, you, yes, you.
And like knowing who you're writing to really helps inform your writing decisions. So not only the language and the tone, but what content to include and what to leave out. Like, is my ideal reader already going to know this information? Are they going to feel like I'm talking down to them if I explain it? Or is this a brand new concept to them that I need to explain?
Such good points. And especially in dealing with experts, right? It's a little bit like I've had people on the podcast who help expert-based businesses create a course, right? And consistently, one of the big mistakes I hear them say that folks make is trying to put everything they know into the course. Right. And maybe I don't know if the same is true of the book writing process, but I would think that process of learning what to filter out, what to include, what stays, what goes is really hard and really important.
Yeah. And then the other thing I would say, a mistake people make, is that they focus too much on the data, like the facts and the research and things like that. But actually, humans are hardwired to remember stories. So if you can focus on like compelling stories that solve a pain point for your ideal reader, then that's what's going to have people not only trust you more, but create rapport with you. They'll be, crawling across broken glass to work with you. And then the other great thing about having a book is that they self-vet, right? They know if they read your book, right, they'll either know for me or not for me. But if you're not for them, they'll probably just stop reading. But the point is that you're not spending your time vetting them and determining whether or not it's a fit. They'll automatically do that and then reach out to you for further relationship if they want it.
I love that relationship of tying that concept together of the book helping to be one of the vetting mechanisms, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. When is the right time for somebody to write a book?
Well, the first thing I'll say is if you're a startup entrepreneur, you shouldn't be writing a book, right? Like in those early days of running a business, you should be focused on revenue, right? And clients and building your client base. But once you're established in your business, or if you're a serial entrepreneur and this isn't your first time, and you have proof of concept, that's a good time to start writing a book, right? The other thing I say is the best time to start writing a book is right now, because you're never going to feel like you have time and you're never going to feel ready. Kind of like when is it a good time to have kids, right? Same thing. Never. So just
Never.
do it now. So
Oh my gosh, hilarious.
yeah,
Hopefully it's a little different on the scale of like not knowing what you're getting yourself into, right? Kids versus a
right,
book, but yeah.
right.
Oh, that's funny. And then what are some questions that people should be asking themselves before they start writing?
Well, first, I would say that question about who am I writing to, right? So getting really
Yeah.
clear and specific on your target reader, your
Yep.
avatar. But I would also ask, like, how am I going to get a return on investment from this book? Because it's either going to
Mm,
cost you a lot of time or a lot of money or both. So one of the conversations I have with authors before we ever start writing is, what do you want this book to do for you? So how are you going to leverage it to build and grow your business or help you meet your goals? And so
mm,
the sub question there is, what are my goals with
yeah.
the business, first of all, not just with the book, but with the business. And then ask yourself, is this book going to help me get to that goal?
So are you getting into all of this stuff with your clients, like in the process of working with them? Is this where you're starting with them? Is like, what is the
Yes.
goal for this? How does this relate to
Yeah.
your overall business plan? All of that?
Yeah, so I start with defining our ideal reader
Mm,
and then creating an avatar from that. So those are asking questions like, what's keeping your ideal reader up at night? What pain are they experiencing, and how do you solve that pain for them? And more specifically, how is the book going to solve that pain for them?
mm,
So in real broad terms, a book is kind of broken up into three parts. One, you identify their pain. Two, you talk about why you can help them solve that pain. And usually it's because you've experienced it and solved it for yourself, or you have a program or something that will help them solve it or guide them through it, and then you solve the problem for them. So
yeah.
it's like,
It's like a mini business plan, right? You're
yeah,
walking people
exactly.
through
Yeah,
essentially a micro business plan for the book.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, and that's a little oversimplified, but just it's a good
Hmm.
place to start of like, what's
Totally.
the problem? How do you solve it? And why am I the best person to solve that problem?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Is there a favorite tip or hack that you like to share with potential book writers?
Yes. Um, I would say if you really want to finish your book, if you're serious about it, you want to create a crisis for yourself, which is simply a fancy way of saying to create an external non-negotiable deadline. That
Yes.
there's no wiggle room. So I have had clients who have um, gotten a sponsor for their book.
Mm,
So then they have some external accountability to someone who has invested in them. I have had
mm,
authors who booked a venue for their book launch and put dollars down, or had their, like I had an author who was in insurance and one of her major clients paid for the book launch. So I've had another author who had an event and sold 1,500 tickets to their event, and the book had to be done for the event. So things like that, where you will get to a point in the book writing where you hit a wall or don't want to continue or are bored of it or sick of your book or whatever. But having that deadline means that
mm.
you power through that in whatever way that looks like. I mean, that varies, but the most successful authors have had this external non-negotiable deadline,
Yeah.
where they just don't have the wiggle room, right? So,
Mm. Oh my gosh, I love that so much. I mean, how many of us, truthfully, if we are honest with ourselves, work better against a
mhm.
deadline, right?
Yeah,
And it is
yeah,
true because, like, if you even for anybody that's familiar with the Colby test, like I just had a guy on, Justin Breen, who is like, it's so funny. If he makes an introduction to another human being for you, he's like, Heather, whatever my numbers are, 7, 3, 6, 4, whatever, right?
yeah,
Meet Rob, you know,
yeah,
6, 4, 9, 1. Anyways, it's
yeah,
hilarious. Like he lives for the Colby, but it does tell you what motivates people.
yeah.
And it was really interesting because I tend to think of myself as like a pretty consistent action taker. But when I look
Hmm.
at my Colby stuff, no,
Hmm.
what motivates me is
Hmm.
deadlines. I'm very
Mhm.
low on the follow through, turns out.
Oh,
But I'm
yes.
really high on quick start. Anyways, it is really interesting, but I love so much this concept of like, create an external crisis or something that you're responsible to that is a
Yeah,
motivator, because it's really like anything, whether it's attending to, I think of people who like teach others about like physical health and like it doesn't matter how you feel today, whether you want to work out
right,
or not, you just go do it, right? It doesn't matter. And for people who are professional writers, doesn't matter whether you feel like writing or not, you get up and you
right.
do it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And it's interesting that you bring up those like personality tendencies and stuff like
Mm,
that. I'm not that familiar with the Covey, but I'm a
mm.
very big fan of Gretchen Rubin. She has the four tendencies. And so there
Ah,
is questioner, upholder, obliger, and rebel. And I use this with my own clients. I'm an obliger. And what that means is I will never break an agreement or a commitment to another person, but I break them to myself all the time. So knowing this means I need to have commitments of goals and deadlines. That means I need to have a personal trainer because I'm not going to work out on my own. If I was writing, it means that I have to be submitting chapters or writing to somebody else and have a call with them once a week,
mm.
that sort of thing, right?
Oh, that's so
Um,
interesting.
Upholders, on the other hand, are very good at being self directed, so they don't need that level of hand holding. Questioners, once they understand the why behind something, they can become upholders, and rebels don't they ignore their own rules and everyone else's rules. So then there's like a you have to take a counter approach and say, oh, don't write your book then if you don't want to. And then they're like, oh, like a little reverse psychology there. But
Totally. It's like that gal on the insurance commercial, right? There's a really funny one lately where the guy, she's like, "Do you want to go get tacos?" He's like, "No." Or he says whatever. I think it's she says, "You want to go get tacos?" He's like, "No, tacos are messy." And she's like, "Yeah, right." And then she just like piles on. And then by the end of it, he's like, "Yeah, let's go get tacos."
yeah.
Anyways, yeah, that's so funny. I think that my son is a questioner. Like
Yeah.
everything is opposite day, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Totally.
So, I mean, and the point is whether it's four tendencies, whether it's,
Mm,
there's so many out there now. I find that it's helpful because I think my internal dialogue before, especially with like, for me, it's not writing, it's fitness. But I just had this whole story about myself that like I'm terrible at working out or I have no willpower or whatever that is. And it's like, oh no, I'm just an obliger. I just need to have a be accountable to
mhm.
another person. And then that takes it out of the morality and
Love
into
it.
this is a tendency. So knowing
Yes.
that, what can I do to set myself up for success?
That's so good. Yeah. Well, and even
Mm,
understanding that, like for so many of us about our clients, right, is really
yes.
helpful. Karen, I love this. This has been so fun to hear about your journey and about, the ways that you support your clients, but also for people that are wanting to write a book,
Mhm.
that have had it on their list for a while, some things that they should be thinking about, because all of this, I think, is really important to understand even before you get started.
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
folks that want to connect with you, where would you send them?
Well, I mean, I would say you can find me just about anywhere on social media, right?
Mhm.
LinkedIn, Instagram. If that's the best way to connect with me,
Mm,
really, probably Instagram.
awesome. So you are a social media person. Some people I ask and they're like, "Oh, just my website," which I totally respect as well if you're not a
I
social
mean, you
media.
can go to my website too. It's KarenRowe.com. I will say though that we didn't talk about this, but I don't really like marketing, and so I don't do marketing. So my Instagram, while it is a business Instagram, it's really mostly about what I'm doing in my life. So if you want to
I
see my
love it.
plants and our yard renovations and our
Right, your
cats,
cute little house.
then,
It's
then you could when I have a book launch or I
mm,
do talk about writing and some of the challenges and things like that, but it's really whatever I'm interested in. And
totally.
people are in a relationship with me, so
That's
you
right.
need to know that if we are going to be working together for 12 months, you've got to decide whether or not that's a fit for you.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
love it.
So
Well, and I know you've also got some other resources. Like I think you've got a rapid results outline tool
yep.
or something. You want to
Yep.
share just for a minute about that? And then I know you also have a course that will walk
Yeah.
people through some of the, I mean, I think all of the things you teach your clients, it's just they could go through it on their
Mhm.
own, right? Will you share for
Yeah.
a minute about those?
Sure. So yeah, I have an online course, and you can find it at bookwritingmaster.com, and the rapid results outline that's there as well.
And
The
I'll
book writing
share the
map.
links. Yeah. So I know the rapid results is a little bit longer of a link, but we'll share those in the show notes page for folks that are interested. You can find those at legalwebsitewarrior.com/podcast. Just find Karen's episode. So yeah, share us for just a minute, Karen, about those resources.
Yeah, so the rapid results outline, I have a lot of people say that I don't know what to write about, or I don't have time to write a book. The rapid results outline, especially if you just mentioned being a quick start, I'm a quick
Yeah.
start too, and it's intended to get your book outline written in 20 minutes. It's basically going to cut your excuses if you're in any kind of analysis paralysis. It's a timed exercise that will basically stop you from overthinking or your inner listening to your inner critic, and it basically just pulls your book right out of you, and then you can use that as the roadmap to get started in your writing. And if you
Mm,
go to bookwritingmaster.com and click on all courses, you'll see that rapid results outline is listed as a course. That is no charge, but it gives you an idea of that quick win of what it would be like to actually get started on your book and have a result instead of
mm.
just reading a bunch of stuff and deciding that you might start it tomorrow. And then the book
Right.
writing masterclass is a continuation once you have the rapid results outline. It's everything
Mm,
that I do with my clients in the book at the beach to get your book written in 6 weeks.
I
Now, I say
love
that with a
that.
caveat that you can't work on anything else if you want a first draft done in 6 weeks, but it's
Yeah.
also designed that you can do, you know, work it into your schedule so that you actually have a realistic way
Yeah.
of accomplishing that goal.
That's amazing. I love these resources that give people a place to start and a way to create that quick win, like that rapid results resource sounds awesome. So if you are listening, hop over and check that out again at the show notes page, legalwebsitewarrior.com/podcast. Karen, such a joy to hear a little bit more about your story. What final tip would you like to leave people with?
I mean, I just say I think everyone has a story to tell. So, and no one's going to know what that story is if you don't write it down. So, I would encourage you to just take the first step, get that rapid results outline, and see what comes up. Because you might not think it's very interesting, but I promise you, there's someone out there that wishes that they had the information that you have in your head and had. So that's what I would
Mm,
say.
I love it. Well, I know, I mean, I'm one of the folks I will readily admit, I feel like I probably have more than one book in me. And I remember when we first met, you talking about this, I need to just go do it. So yeah, I'm going to be one of the folks on the list that goes and checks out that resource.
Yeah.
Karen, such a joy to see you. I'm so
Thanks
glad.
so much.
Yes, I'm so glad that we were able to connect.
Yeah, me too. Take care.